Hello, you all. We've got another great ghost story for you. This one just happens to be written by Bram Stoker. This one, though, is called The Judge's House, not the Dracula story. Anyway, we have The Judge's House by Bram Stoker. And I didn't really mean to roll my R there. It just happened. When the time for his examination drew near, Malcolmson made up his mind to go somewhere to read by himself. He feared the attractions of the seaside, and also he feared completely rural isolation. For of old he knew its charms, and so he determined to find some unpretentious little town where there would be nothing to distract him. He refrained from asking suggestions from any of his friends, for he argued that each would recommend some place of which he had knowledge, and where he had already acquaintances. As Malcolmson wished to avoid friends, he had no wish to encumber himself with the attention of friends, and so he determined to look out for a place for himself. He packed up a portmanteau with some clothes and all of the books he required, and then he took ticket for the first name on the local timetable, which he did not know. When at the end of 3 hours' journey he alighted at Benchurch, he felt satisfied that he had so far obliterated his tracks as to be sure of having a peaceful opportunity of pursuing his studies. He went straight to the one inn which the sleepy little place contained, and put up for the night. Benchurch was the market town, and once in 3 weeks was crowded to excess, but for the remainder of the 21 days it was as attractive as a desert. Malcolmson looked around the day after his arrival to find quarters more isolated than even so quiet an inn as the good traveler afforded. There was only one place which took his fancy, and it certainly satisfied his wildest ideas regarding quiet. In fact, quiet was not the proper word to apply to it. Desolation was the only term conveying any suitable idea of its isolation. It was an old, rambling, heavy-built house of the Jacobean style, with heavy gables and windows, unusually small and set higher than was customary in such houses, and was surrounded with a high brick wall, massively built indeed. On examination, it looked more like a fortified house than an ordinary dwelling. But all these things pleased Malcolmson. Here, he thought, is the very spot I have been looking for, and if I can only get opportunity of using it, I shall be happy. His joy was increased when he realized, beyond doubt, that it was not at present inhabited. From the post office he got the name of the agent, who was rarely surprised at the application to rent a part of the old house. Mr. Cranford, the local lawyer and agent, was a genial old man, and frankly confessed his delight at anyone being willing to live in the house. To tell you the truth, he said, I should only be too happy, on behalf of the owners, to let anyone have the house rent-free for a term of years, if only to accustom the people here to see it inhabited. It has been so long empty that some kind of absurd prejudice has grown up about it, and this can be best put down by its occupation, if only, he added with a sly glance at Malcolmson, by a scholar like yourself, who wants it quiet for a time. Malcolmson thought it needless to ask the agent about the absurd prejudice. He knew he would get more information, if he should require it, on the subject from other quarters. He paid his 3 months' rent, got a receipt, and the name of an old woman who would probably undertake to do for him, and came away with the key in his pocket. He then went to the landlady of the inn, who was a cheerful and most kindly person, and asked her advice as to such stores and provisions as he would likely to require. She threw up her hands in amazement when he told her where he was going to settle himself. "Not in the judge's house," she said, and grew pale as she spoke. He explained the locality of the house, saying that he did not know its name. When he had finished, she answered, "Aye, sure enough. Aye, sure enough, the very place. It is the judge's house, sure enough." He asked her to tell him about the place, why so called, and what there was against it. She told him that it was so called locally because it had been many years before. How long she could not say, as she was herself from another part of the country. But she thought it most excuse me. But she thought it most have been 100 years or more, the abode of a judge who had held in great terror on account of his harsh sentences and his hostility to prisoners at assizes. As to what there was against the house itself, she could not tell. She had often asked, but no one could inform her. But there was a general feeling that there was something. And for her own part, she could not take all the money in Drinkwater's bank and stay in the house for an hour by herself. Then she apologized to Malcolmson for her disturbing talk. "It is too bad for me, sir, and you, and a young gentleman, too, if you will pardon me saying it, going to live there all alone. If you were my boy, and you'll excuse me for saying it, you wouldn't sleep there a night. Not if I had to go there myself and pull the big alarm bell that's on the roof." The good creature was so manifestly in earnest, and was so kindly in her intentions, that Malcolmson, although amused, was touched. He told her kindly how much he appreciated her interest in him, and added, "But my dear Miss Witham, indeed you need not be concerned about me. A man who is reading from a mathematical tripos has too much to think of to be disturbed by any of these mysterious somethings, and his work is of too exact and prosaic a kind to allow of his having any corner in his mind for mysteries of any kind. Harmonical progression, permutations, and combinations, and elliptic functions have sufficient mysteries for me." Miss Witham kindly undertook to see after his commissions, and he went himself to look for the old woman who had been recommended to him when he returned to the judge's house with her. After an interval of a couple of hours, he found Miss Witham herself waiting with several men and boys carrying parcels, and an upholsterer's man with a bed in a cart. For she said, though tables and chairs might be all very well, a bed that hadn't been aired for mayhap 50 years was not proper for a young bones to lie on. She was evidently curious to see the inside of the house, and though manifestly so afraid of the somethings that at the slightest sound she clutched on to Malcolmson, whom she never left for a moment, went over the whole place. After his examination of the house, Malcolmson decided to take up his abode with a great dining room, which was big enough to serve for all his requirements. And Miss Witham, with the aid of the charwoman, Miss Dempster, proceeded to arrange matters. When the hampers were brought in and unpacked, Malcolmson saw that with much kind forethought, she had sent for her own kitchen sufficient provisions to last for a few days. Before going, she expressed all sorts of kind wishes, and that the door turned, and said, "And perhaps, sir, as the room is big and daughtry, it might be well to have one of those big screens put round your bed at night. Though, truth to tell, I would die myself if I were to be so shut in with all kinds of things that put their heads round the sides or over the top and look on me." The image which she had called up was too much for her nerves, and she fled incontinently. Miss Dempster sniffed in a superior manner as the landlady disappeared, and remarked that for her own part she wasn't afraid of all the boogies in the kingdom. "I'll tell you what it is, sir," she said. "Boogies is all kinds of sorts of things, except boogies. Rats and mice and beetles and creaky doors and loose slates and broken panes and stiff drawer handles to stay out when you pull them and then fall down in the middle of the night. Look at the wainscot of the room. It is old, hundreds of years old. Do you think there's no rats and beetles there? And do you imagine, sir, that you won't see none of them? Rats as boogies, I tell you, and boogies as rats, and don't get me to think anything else." "Miss Dempster," said Malcolmson gravely, making her a polite bow, "you know more than a senior wrangler, and let me say that as a mark of esteem for your indubitable soundness of head and heart, I shall, when I go, give you possession of this house, and let you stay here by yourself for at least 2 months of my tenancy. For 4 weeks will serve my purpose." "Thank you kindly, sir," she answered, "but I couldn't sleep away from home a night. I am a greenhouse charity, and if I slept a night away from my rooms, I should lose all I have got to live on. The rules is very strict, and there's too many watching for a vacancy for me to run any risks in the matter. Only for that, sir, I'd gladly come here and attend on you altogether during your stay." "My good woman," said Malcolmson hastily, "I have come here on purpose to obtain solitude, and believe me that I am grateful to the late Greenhow for having so organized his admired charity. Whatever it is that I am perforce denied the opportunity of suffering from such a form of temptation, St. Anthony himself could not be more rigid on the point." The old woman laughed harshly. "Ah, you young gentlemen," she said, "you don't fear for naught, and belike you'll get all the solitude you want here." She set to work with her cleaning, and by nightfall, when Malcolmson returned from his walk, he always had one of his books to study as he walked. He found the room swept and tidied, a fire burning in the old hearth, a lamp lit, and the table spread for supper with Miss Wortham's excellent fare. "This is comfort, indeed," he said as he rubbed his hands. When he had finished his supper and lifted the tray to the other end of the great oak dining table, he got out his books again, put fresh wood on the fire, trimmed his lamp, and set himself down to a spell of real hard work. He went on, without pause, till about 11 o'clock, when he knocked off for a bit to fix his fire and lamp, and make himself a cup of tea. He had always been a tea drinker, and during his college life had sat late at work and had taken tea late. The rest was a great luxury to him, and he enjoyed it with a sense of delicious, voluptuous ease. The renewed fire leaped and sparkled, and threw quaint shadows through the great old room, and as he sipped his hot tea, he reveled in the sense of isolation from his kind. Then it was that he began to notice, for the first time, what a noise the rats were making. Surely, he thought, they could not have been at it all the time I was reading. Had they been? I must have noticed it. Presently, when the noise increased, he satisfied himself that it was really new. It was evident that at first the rats had been frightened at the presence of a stranger, and the light of a fire and lamp, but that, as the time went on, they had grown bolder, and were now disporting themselves, as was their wont. How busy they were, and hark to the strange noise. Up and down, behind the wainscot, over the ceiling, and under the floor they raced, and gnawed, and scratched. Malcolmson smiled to himself as he recalled to mind the saying of Miss Dempster, "Boogies is rats, and rats is boogies." The tea began to have its effect of intellectual and nervous stimulus. He saw with joy another long spell of work to be done before the night was past, and in the sense of security which it gave him, he allowed himself the luxury of a good look round the room. He took his lamp in one hand and went all around, wondering that so quaint and beautiful an old house had been so long neglected. The carving of the oak on the panels of the wainscot was fine, and on the round the doors and windows it was beautiful and of rare merit. There were some old pictures on the walls, but they were coated so thick with dust and dirt that he could not distinguish any detail of them, though he held his lamp as high as he could over his head. Here and there, as he went round, he saw some crack or hole blocked for the moment by the face of a rat, with its bright eyes glittering in the light. But in an instant it was gone, and a squeak and a scamper followed. The thing that most struck him, however, was the rope of the great alarm bell on the roof, which hung down in a corner of the room on the right-hand side of the fireplace. He pulled up close to the hearth, a great high-backed carved oak chair, and sat down with his last cup of tea. When this was done, he made up the fire and went back to his work, sitting at the corner of the table. Having the fire to his left, for a while the rats disturbed him somewhat for their perpetual scampering, but he got accustomed to the noise, as one does to the ticking of a clock or the roar of a moving water, and he became so immersed in his work that everything in the world, except the problem which he was trying to solve, passed away from him. He suddenly looked up. His problem was still unsolved, and there was in the air that sense of the hour before the dawn, which is so dread to doubtful life. The noise of the rats had ceased. Indeed, it seemed to him that it must have ceased but lately, and that it was the sudden cessation which had disturbed him. The fire had fallen low, but still it threw out a deep red glow. As he looked, he started in spite of his sang-froid. There, on the great high-back carved oak chair by the right side of the fireplace, sat an enormous rat, steadily glaring at him with baleful eyes. He made a motion to it as though to hunt it away, but it did not stir. Then he made the motion of throwing something. Still It did not stir, but showed its great white teeth angrily, and its cruel eyes shone in the lamplight with an added vindictiveness. Malcolmson felt amazed, and seizing the poker from the hearth, ran at it to kill it. Before, however, he could strike it, the rat, with a squeak that sounded like a concentration of hate, jumped upon the floor, and running up the rope of the alarm bell, disappeared in the darkness beyond the range of the green-shaded lamp. Instantly, strange to say, the noisy scampering of the rats in the wainscot began again. By this time, Malcolmson's mind was quite off the problem, and as a shrill cock crow outside told him of the approaching morning, he went to bed and to sleep. He slept so sound that he was not even waked by Miss Dampshire coming in to make up his room. It was only when she had tidied up the place and got his breakfast ready and tapped on the screen which closed in his bed that he woke. He was a little tired still after his night's hard work, but a strong cup of tea soon freshened him up, and, taking his book, he went out for his morning walk, bringing with him a few sandwiches, lest he could not care to return till dinner time. He found a quiet walk between high elms some way outside the town, and here he spent the greater part of the day studying his Laplace. On his return, he looked in to see Miss Witham, and to thank her for her kindness. When she saw him coming through a diamond-paned bay window of her sanctum, she came out to meet him and asked him in. She looked at him searchingly and shook her head as she said, "You must not overdo it, sir. You are paler this morning than you should be. 2 late hours and 2 hard work on the brain isn't good for any man. But tell me, sir, how did you pass the night? Well, I hope. But my heart, sir, I was glad when Miss Dampshire told me this morning that you were all right and sleeping sound when she went in." "Oh, I was all right," he answered, smiling. "The somethings didn't worry me as yet, only the rats, and they had a circus, I tell you, all over the place. There was one wicked-looking old devil that sat up on my chair by the fire, and wouldn't go till I took the poker to him, and then he ran up the rope of the alarm bell and got to somewhere up the wall or ceiling, I couldn't see where, it was so dark." "Mercy on us," said Miss Witham. "An old devil, and sitting on a chair by the fireside. Take care, sir, take care. There's many a true word spoken in jest." "How do you mean? 'Pon my word, I don't understand." "An old devil. The old devil, perhaps. There, sir, you needn't laugh." For Malcolmson, he had broken into a hearty peal. "You young fellows think it easy to laugh at things that makes older ones shudder. Never mind, sir, never mind. Please God, you'll laugh all the time. It's what I wish you myself." And the good lady beamed all over in sympathy with his enjoyment, her fears gone for a moment. "Oh, forgive me," said Malcolmson presently. "Don't think me rude, but the idea was too much for me. The old devil himself was on the chair last night." And at that thought he laughed again. Then he went home to dinner. This evening, the scampering of the rats began earlier. Indeed, it had been going on before his arrival, and only ceased whilst his presence by its freshness disturbed them. After dinner, he sat by the fire for a while, and had a smoke, and then, having cleared his table, began to work as before. Tonight, the rats disturbed him more than they had done on the previous night. How they scampered up and down, and under and over. How they squeaked and scratched and gnawed. How they, getting bolder by degrees, came to the mouths of their holes into the chinks and cracks and crannies in the wainscoting, till their eyes shone like tiny lamps as the firelight rose and fell. But to him, no doubtless accustomed to them, their eyes were not wicked. Their only playfulness touched them. Sometimes the boldest of them made sallies out on the floor and along the moldings of the wainscot. Now and again, as they disturbed him, Malcolmson made a sound to frighten them, smiting the table and his hand, or giving a fierce "Hush, hush," so that they fled straight away to their holes. And so the early part of the night wore on, and despite the noise, Malcolmson got more and more immersed in his work. All at once he stopped, as on the previous night, being overcome by a sudden sense of silence. There was not the faintest sound of gnaw, or scratch, or squeak. The silence was as of the grave. He remembered the odd occurrence on the previous night, and instinctively he looked at the chair standing close by the fireside. And then a very odd sensation thrilled through him. There, on the great old high-back carved oak chair beside the fireplace, sat the same enormous rat, steadily glaring at him with baleful eyes. Instinctively, he took the nearest thing to his hand, a book of logarithms, and flung it at it. The book was badly aimed, and the rat did not stir. So again, the poker performance of the previous night was repeated, and again the rat, being closely pursued, fled up the rope of the alarm bell. Strangely, too, the departure of this rat was instantly followed by the renewal of the noise made by the general rat community. On this occasion, as on the previous one, Malcolmson could not see at what part of the room the rat disappeared, for the green shade of his lamp left the upper part of the room in darkness, and the fire had burned low. On looking at his watch, he found it was close to midnight, and not sorry for the divertissement. He made up his fire and made himself nightly pot of tea. He had got through a good spell of work, and thought himself entitled to a cigarette, and so he sat at the great carved oak chair before the fire and enjoyed it. While smoking, he began to think that he would like to know where the rat disappeared to, for he had certain ideas for the morrow, not entirely disconnected with the rat trap. Accordingly, he lit another lamp and placed it so that it would shine well into the right-hand corner of the wall by the fireplace. Then he got all the books he had with him and placed them handy to throw at the vermin. Finally, he lifted the rope of the alarm bell and placed the end of it on the table, fixing the extreme end under the lamp. As he handled it, he could not help noticing how pliable it was, especially for so strong a rope, and one not in use. You could hang a man with it, he thought to himself. When his preparations were made, he looked around and said complacently, "There now, my friend, I think we shall learn something of you this time." He began his work again, and though as before somewhat disturbed at first by the noise of rats, soon lost himself in his propositions and problems. Again he was called to his immediate surroundings suddenly. This time it might not have been the sudden silence only which took his attention. There was a slight movement of the rope, and the lamp moved without stirring. He looked to see his pile of books was within range, and then cast his eye along the rope. As he looked, he saw the great rat drop from the rope on the oak armchair and sit there glaring at him. He raised a book in his right hand, and taking careful aim, flung it at the rat. The latter, with a quick movement, sprang aside and dodged the missile. And he then took another book, and a third, and flung them one after another at the rat, but each time unsuccessfully. At last, as he stood with a book poised in his hand to throw, the rat squeaked and seemed afraid. This made Malcolmson more than ever eager to strike, and the book flew and struck the rat, a resounding blow. It gave a terrified squeak, and turning on its pursuer, a look of terrified malevolence, ran up the chair back, and made a great jump to the rope of the alarm bell, and ran it up it like lightning. The lamp rocked under the sudden strain, but it was a heavy one, and did not topple over. Malcolmson kept his eyes on the rat, and saw it by the light of the second lamp leap to the molding of the wainscot and disappear through a hole in one of the great pictures which hung on the wall, obscured and invisible through its coating of dirt and dust. "I shall look up my friend's habitation in the morning," said the student, as he went over to collect his books. "The third picture from the fireplace I shall not forget." He picked up the books one by one, commenting on them as he lifted them. Conic sections he does not mind, nor concital oscillations, nor the Principia, nor quantirons, nor thermodynamics. Now, for the book that fetched him. Malcolmson took it up and looked at it. And so he started, and a sudden pallor overspread his face. He looked round uneasily and shivered slightly, as he murmured to himself, "The Bible my mother gave me. What an odd coincidence." He sat down to work again, and the rats in the wainscot renewed their gambols. They did not disturb him, however. Somehow their presence gave him a sense of companionship. But he could not attend to his work, and after striving to master the subject on which he was engaged, gave it up in despair, and went to bed as the first streak of dawn stole in through the eastern window. You guys will have to tune in for part 2 to see what happens to Mr. Malcolmson at his stay in the judge's house, written by Bram Stoker. You all have a wonderful and blessed day.